In the heart of the Rockies, when winter's brutal grip tightens, one man's invention would stand between survival and death. The icy winds howl, wolves prowl, and every second counts, but Samuel's crazy meat rack might be the only thing that keeps them all alive. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love frontier survival stories that reveal the hidden ingenuity of the wilderness, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable than today's. Samuel Bridger had long known the unforgiving nature of the Rockies. Each winter, the mountains would descend into a chilling silence where the snow buried everything beneath a blanket of deathly white. For a man like Samuel, there was no luxury of waiting for the storm to pass. Survival was something you fought for every day, or you didn't survive at all. As dusk fell, the howl of wolves echoed through the timber, a haunting reminder of the wild things that still roamed the mountains. Samuel stood outside his log cabin, his breath visible in the frigid air, and adjusted the meat rack he had constructed. The rack stood in stark contrast to the simple cabins most trappers used. This one was engineered for more than just hanging meat. The meat itself, strips of venison and elk, hung frozen and rigid, their scent drifting on the wind. He didn't need to be told that the wolves were circling. It was only a matter of time before they would come closer. They always did. The pack would test their luck, wait until the first crack in the defense. They would attempt to overwhelm any unprepared trapper, but Samuel wasn't unprepared. His creation was an oddity, a strange amalgamation of rudimentary design and brilliant survival instinct. Made from logs stripped of bark, carefully cut to exact lengths, it resembled a simple rack for drying meat. But it was more, much more. It had been meticulously crafted with one goal: to keep the wolves at bay for good. For days, Samuel had observed the wolves' behavior. He knew they were relentless and cunning. The meat they sought was easy prey, but there was something about Samuel's method that had so far kept them at bay. The rack was surrounded by a series of lines, thin enough that the wolves couldn't easily spot the traps, yet strategically placed to give Samuel time to react if they grew bolder. But tonight felt different. The wolves' howls were closer now, sharper, more purposeful. They were on the move. He could feel the chill seep deeper into his bones as the winter night dragged on. Samuel grabbed his rifle and stepped away from the cabin, his breath misting in the cold air. His gaze flicked between the meat rack and the woods behind him. Every shadow seemed to twitch. Every movement felt like it could signal the wolves' approach. The pack would come soon. Samuel had no illusions about that. But this time, it wasn't just meat that was hanging on that rack. It was his will to survive. The night stretched on, and Samuel remained at his post, his rifle resting at his side. The silence of the snow-covered land was deafening, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of the trees as the wind whipped through them. The pack of wolves had circled several times already, their eyes glinting in the dark. They were watching, waiting, but they had not made their move yet. Samuel had learned long ago that the wilderness didn't make mistakes. The wolves were predators, but they were also survivors. They didn't waste energy on impossible hunts, and they never made a move until they were certain of success. Tonight, they were calculating, weighing their options. He glanced over at the meat rack again. It stood firm, just as it had all winter. But he knew better than to assume the wolves would leave it alone. It was too easy a target. The pungent scent of dried meat hung heavily in the cold air, and though Samuel had made every effort to mask it, the wolves were too keen to miss it. It would only be a matter of time before they decided to strike. The strange contraption he had built was designed to keep them at bay. Each piece of rawhide, each bit of wire strung between the logs, had a purpose. The design, though crude, was genius in its simplicity. But even with all of his precautions, Samuel knew that it was only a matter of time before the wolves found a way around it. He'd seen it happen before. A pack of wolves would break through when you least expected it, finding the smallest gap in the defense. His fingers wrapped tightly around the barrel of his rifle as his eyes scanned the dark trees beyond. A figure emerged from the shadows, one of the wolves, just the outline of a shadow moving through the underbrush. Then another, and another. They were getting closer. Samuel had built his shelter to withstand the punishing winters, but he knew that wolves had a way of circumventing even the strongest defenses. He'd heard stories of men whose cabins had been torn apart, whose food had been stolen, and whose lives had been upended by the wolves' insatiable hunger. He couldn't afford to make the same mistake. With his rifle ready, Samuel steadied his breath. The moment of truth was at hand. Would his creation hold, or would the wolves prove to be a force too powerful to stop? As the wolves neared, their eyes glinted in the darkness, and Samuel stood, waiting for the inevitable test of his ingenuity. The first attack came before Samuel could blink. One moment the wolves were circling in the distance, their presence just a shadow in the moonlight. The next, they were darting toward the meat rack like a blur of fangs and fur. The cold air hummed with the low growls of their hunger. Samuel's pulse quickened. His instincts took over. He dropped to a crouch, positioning himself behind the low wall of snow that surrounded the cabin, keeping his silhouette hidden from the predators. He knew that if they saw him, it would be over. They were smart enough to wait for the right moment. The pack was smaller than he expected, no more than 4 wolves. They circled the rack with cautious precision, their noses twitching as they scented the air. Samuel could hear the scrape of their paws against the snow, the sound of their breath clouding the freezing night. The wolves moved like ghosts, their eyes gleaming with sharp intelligence. He steadied his rifle and pressed it to his shoulder, the weight of the weapon familiar in his grip. His heart beat in time with the thud of his boots in the snow, and he took a slow, careful breath. Time stretched in those moments, each second feeling like a lifetime. He knew the danger wasn't just from the wolves. It was from the desperate gamble he had placed with his meat rack. He had built it to withstand the wolves' force, but he had never tested it against this many creatures at once. The wolves circled closer, testing the structure with their noses, nudging the dangling meat, as if measuring it for weakness. Their paws scratched the snow as they worked in unison, their eyes scanning for an opening. Samuel clenched his teeth. The wolves were studying the rack, just as he had. He knew it wouldn't take long for them to find a way in. Then, without warning, the largest of the wolves lunged forward. It came at the meat, jaws open, teeth flashing like knives in the moonlight. The rack swayed, but Samuel had reinforced the structure with iron nails and thick, sturdy logs. The wolf's attack bounced off it, and the creature let out a startled yelp. The other wolves hesitated, momentarily thrown off by the resistance, but they quickly regrouped. They attacked again, this time with more urgency. One wolf darted around the side of the rack, its sharp eyes fixed on the edges where the meat hung, trying to reach the lower strips that hung just beyond the iron pins. Samuel held his breath. The tension was unbearable. He had prepared for this. The meat rack wasn't just a storage solution, it was a weapon in disguise. He had designed it to swing when tampered with, creating a barrier of tangled wire and swinging logs that would confuse and trap any predator foolish enough to get too close. But he'd never faced a group this coordinated. The wolf's paw slipped between 2 logs. It gave a low growl, its teeth flashing in frustration. Samuel's heart pounded as he watched the situation unfold. He could almost hear the wolves' thoughts. If they couldn't break through the meat, they'd come for him next. But just as the leader lunged again, something unexpected happened. The entire structure of the meat rack shifted, moving in a way that none of the wolves had predicted. The weight of the carcasses hanging from the rack caused it to sway violently. And in an instant, the wolf that had reached too far was trapped. The log that had swung down caught the animal by the shoulder, and the force of the impact sent it tumbling backward into the snow. The rest of the pack howled in frustration, their coordination slipping as panic set in. Samuel's gamble had paid off. for now. But the wolves weren't done. The leader, now growling in irritation, circled the rack again, watching for another opportunity. Samuel knew the wolves would return with more tactics, and the battle for survival was just beginning. The night stretched on, the wolves retreating only to regroup in the distance. Their howls echoed through the quiet of the mountain wilderness, a reminder that danger was never far away. Samuel stood motionless in the cold, his rifle still clutched tightly in his hand. His eyes never left the meat rack. He was alive, yes, but he knew that the wolves would not give up so easily. They were relentless, patient, and cunning. For the next few hours, Samuel stood guard, his breath coming in shallow bursts, watching every move the pack made. Each time they returned to test the rack, he was there, a silent figure in the night, waiting for the moment they would try again. He had always known that living in the mountains meant living with constant risk, but tonight he realized that even the most well-prepared man could be at the mercy of the wilderness. The wolves did not return immediately, but they lingered just beyond the tree line, watching. Samuel knew this would be a long night. They were learning from their first failed attack, and if they tried again, they would be more precise, more methodical. As the night deepened, Samuel moved silently across the snow, circling the cabin to check for any signs of weakness in his defenses. The cold gnawed at his face, biting through his furs. His breath steamed in the frigid air as he surveyed the area. The wolves were testing the perimeter, trying to find a gap in his defenses. Samuel's fingers itched for his rifle, but he knew better than to give away his position. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous predator wasn't always the one that attacked first. Sometimes it was the one that waited. The snow creaked beneath his boots as he moved back toward the cabin. He paused, listening. The silence was thick and heavy, almost suffocating. Samuel couldn't help but wonder how much longer the meat rack would hold. It had worked tonight, but that was just luck. He had built it, yes, but he was beginning to feel the weight of uncertainty creeping in. Was it enough? Was he enough? But just as those thoughts began to cloud his mind, he heard it again, the howls. Closer this time. The pack was coming back for another try. Samuel turned toward the rack, feeling his muscles tense. He knew what was coming. This was the test. It would either work or he would lose everything. His eyes narrowed, and with a steady hand, he readied his rifle once more. Samuel had seen wolves in the mountains before, but this was different. They were no longer just testing the meat rack. They were studying it, analyzing its weaknesses with the kind of precision that only predators of the wild could possess. He could hear them moving around the periphery of the cabin, their soft steps muffled by the snow, but their eyes always fixed on the rack, never wavering. The howling had stopped. In its place there was a tense silence, broken only by the occasional growl from the leader of the pack. Samuel felt a knot form in his stomach. He was used to fighting for his survival in these harsh mountains, but this was different. It was no longer just about keeping them at bay. The wolves had tasted failure, but they weren't discouraged. They were patient, and patient wolves were dangerous wolves. He crouched low behind the snowdrift, his rifle still in his grasp, his mind racing. His fingers trembled ever so slightly, a sign of the exhaustion that had set in after hours of standing guard. His eyes darted from the meat rack to the trees, looking for any movement in the darkness. He knew better than to underestimate the wolves. They were opportunistic, and they wouldn't give up until they had either succeeded or been driven away. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. And then there it was, the flicker of movement. One of the wolves, the largest of the pack, slipped from the shadows, its eyes locked on the meat hanging from the rack. It had learned from the first attack. This time, it would not rush in blindly. The leader circled the rack, its eyes moving from the hanging strips of meat to the ground beneath. It sniffed the snow carefully, its keen nose working overtime. It knew that the meat was tantalizingly close, But there was something different about the setup this time. It had learned that simply charging at it was futile. The rack had proven too sturdy, too resistant to brute force. Samuel watched it with growing anxiety. His invention was holding, but for how long? The wolves were waiting for a mistake. His mistake. Then, another wolf joined the first, and another, until the entire pack was encircling the rack. They were positioning themselves in a pattern, almost as though they had rehearsed it. Samuel's heart thudded louder, and his grip on the rifle tightened. They were preparing to make their move. One of the wolves, a smaller, faster one, darted beneath the rack, weaving in and out of the logs, trying to find an opening. It was quick, almost invisible in the snow, but Samuel could see it now. It wasn't trying to attack the meat directly. It was looking for a weakness in the structure itself, a flaw in the design. A sudden surge of adrenaline shot through Samuel's veins. He couldn't let them find it. He took a deep breath, raised his rifle, and steadied his aim. This was the moment he had been preparing for, but even as he aimed, doubt gnawed at the back of his mind. He had built the rack to survive against the wolves, but would it be enough? A wolf lunged, its teeth bared, and with it the rest of the pack followed. Shoot! Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger. The blast from Samuel's rifle echoed through the still night, sending a shockwave of sound and smoke into the air. The lead wolf yelped in pain, its body crumpling to the ground, but it wasn't enough to drive the rest of the pack away. Instead, they backed off momentarily, giving Samuel the split second he needed to reassess the situation. But there was no time to feel relief. The pack had now tasted blood, and the remaining wolves were more desperate than ever. They had witnessed one of their own fall, but it only seemed to heighten their resolve. The leader, now wounded, but still very much alive, barked orders. The other wolves began circling even more aggressively, their movements faster, more frantic. They were no longer testing the meat rack, they were attacking it with a single-minded purpose. Samuel's heart raced as he watched them. He had hit the leader, but it wasn't the end of the pack. It was just the beginning of their true assault. The wolves knew the risks now, but they were determined to win. He had one chance to survive this, to protect what was his. He quickly moved toward the rack, keeping his body low, using the cover of the snowbanks and trees to his advantage. But as he neared the structure, something changed. The wolves had adapted. The one he'd shot was still lying in the snow, but the others were moving with purpose. They no longer tried to attack directly. Instead, they were attempting to dismantle the entire structure. One of them darted underneath the rack again, its body low to the ground. With a sudden violent movement, it tugged at one of the ropes holding the meat in place, pulling it loose from the supporting logs. The meat swayed, but the wolves were focused now on bringing the entire rack down piece by piece. Samuel cursed under his breath. His hands were frozen stiff, but his resolve was still sharp. He couldn't let them succeed. If they brought the rack down, the wolves would have all the meat they needed, and Samuel would be left with nothing. The pack's movements grew more frantic. With each tug on the ropes, the structure of the meat rack began to tremble. The carefully placed logs, the iron pins, the intricate web of wire and rope were starting to give way under the wolves' relentless attacks. Samuel raised his rifle again, but this time he wasn't aiming at the wolves. He aimed at the logs holding the rack in place. With a single shot, he aimed to dislodge one of the key supports, hoping that the structure would collapse in such a way that the wolves would be forced to abandon their efforts. He fired. The shot rang true, and the log splintered on impact. The rack lurched violently, sending a cascade of frozen meat crashing to the ground, creating a momentary barrier between the wolves and their prize. For a brief moment, the wolves hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden collapse. Samuel took the opportunity to grab what was left of the rack and drag it behind him, back toward the cabin. He was only halfway there when the pack recovered, their growls filled with renewed fury. But Samuel was running out of time. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body screaming in protest, but he had no choice. Survival was the only thing that mattered now. With the wolves closing in, he reached the cabin and slammed the door shut, knowing that the fight for survival wasn't over, it had only just begun. The cabin door slammed shut behind Samuel with a finality that echoed through the mountain silence. His breath came in heavy gasps as he leaned against it, trying to steady his pounding heart. His fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the raw intensity of the battle he had just faced. The wolves were still out there, circling, waiting for another chance to strike. He turned quickly, scanning the small interior of the cabin. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The meat rack had collapsed. The wolves had seen to that. But Samuel had managed to drag the remaining carcasses to safety, at least for now. The wolves would return. They were persistent, hungry, and clever. He knew they wouldn't give up until they had what they came for. Samuel moved to the window, pulling aside the heavy fur drapes to peer out into the night. The world outside was bathed in a cold, ghostly light. The snow-covered ground stretched out in every direction, undisturbed except for the faint marks of wolf tracks and the occasional broken twig. The wolves were no longer visible, but their presence loomed large in his mind. The night had fallen into an eerie stillness, the kind of silence that made every sound seem amplified. He could hear his own heartbeat, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional scrape of claws against the snow. It was too quiet, too calm. Samuel knew this was the time they would strike. The wolves were waiting, watching, their eyes hidden in the darkness. They would wait for him to make a mistake, to slip up. They were testing him just as he had tested them. He had no illusions about his chances. Even with his rifle, he was a lone man against a pack of determined predators. His mind raced. What more could he do? He had already reinforced the door, barricaded the windows, and moved the remaining meat inside the cabin. But he knew that none of that would matter if the wolves decided to come at him with full force. He had faced dangers before, but nothing quite like this. Samuel turned away from the window, the reality of the situation settling in. The wolves would come soon. There was no more hiding. They had learned his tactics, and they would adapt. The question was, could his cabin hold up against their determination? And would he? The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of the wind and the occasional distant howl. Samuel loaded his rifle, checking the barrel and the trigger one last time. He wasn't sure if it would be enough, but it was all he had. The wolves weren't just after food anymore, they were after victory, after proving their superiority in the mountain wilderness. Samuel paced the small cabin, glancing around at the sparse furnishings. The warmth of the fire was a comfort, but it felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to the danger lurking outside. He paused near the door, listening intently. The wolves were still out there, and he could feel their eyes on him. His stomach churned with unease, but he forced himself to remain calm. Then he heard it. A soft rustling, a movement in the snow outside. The wolves were making their move. The wolves' attack came swiftly and silently, as if they had been waiting for this moment for hours. Samuel's heart raced as he heard the first scrape of claws against the door, followed by the deep, low growl of the pack's leader. His grip on the rifle tightened as he took a steadying breath. This was it. The moment he had prepared for, the moment when his survival instincts would either carry him through or fail him. The door shuddered under the pressure of the wolves' force. One of them, the same large alpha, slammed against it, testing the strength of the cabin's defenses. Samuel could feel the weight of the blow through the timber. His eyes flicked to the window where the shadows of the pack began to move in the darkness, their eyes glowing like embers. He had done everything he could to prepare for this moment, but there was no way to know if it would be enough. The cabin, sturdy as it was not invincible. The wolves were relentless, and they were smart. They would keep coming until they succeeded or until they were driven away for good. Samuel moved to the gun port he had created earlier. A narrow slit in the wall, just wide enough to fire through, but small enough to keep him hidden. He crouched low, steadying his rifle, and aimed through the slit at the wolves' approaching shadows. His breath was shallow as he focused on the leader, its form just visible against the backdrop of the night. The alpha was circling, testing the door again, its fangs bared in frustration. Samuel could see the other wolves flanking the cabin, their movements coordinated, methodical. He waited. The cold air bit at his skin as his hands remained steady on the rifle. He could hear the pounding of his heart, the quiet murmurs of the wind outside, and the heavy breathing of the wolves as they continued their assault. Each second stretched out like an eternity. Then the alpha lunged again, its teeth scraping against the door. The force of the blow rattled the frame, and Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger. He fired. The shot rang out, deafening, in the confined space of the cabin. The wolf yelped, its body jerking as it collapsed in the snow. But the pack didn't retreat. They were too determined, too hungry. Samuel quickly reloaded, his movements mechanical, as he prepared for the next attack. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, heightening his senses, sharpening his focus. Another wolf, this time a smaller one, darted in front of the door, testing its defenses. Samuel fired again, hitting it in the chest. The wolf fell, but still, the others advanced. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the toll of the long hours of waiting, the endless tension of trying to stay one step ahead. The wolves' growls grew louder, closer, and Samuel realized that he had only a few more shots before they would break through. The door splintered once more as another wolf slammed into it, but this time it was different. Samuel knew that they were no longer just trying to get in. They were trying to force him out. The wolves had tasted blood, and they would stop at nothing to claim their prize. He took a deep breath, knowing that this fight was far from over. This was his final stand, and he would fight with everything he had. With his rifle ready and his back to the wall, Samuel waited for the wolves to make their move. The next attack would decide everything. The wolves were relentless. The night had stretched on for what felt like hours, but in reality it had only been minutes since the last assault. Samuel could hear their growls, their scraping claws on the door and walls, as they tested every weak point in his defenses. His breath came in sharp, cold bursts, and his body was beginning to feel the toll of the prolonged battle. He had killed 2 of them already, but there were more. The pack was undeterred. With every shot he fired, another wolf seemed to take its place, an ever-growing wave of hunger and ferocity that seemed impossible to quell. The door had started to splinter, and he could see the first cracks forming along the log frame. The wolves were getting smarter, working together. He could hear their growls deepen in anger, frustration, and determination. Samuel's hand clenched tighter around his rifle. It was all he had left, but the gun was becoming less useful with every passing moment. The wolves were testing every inch of the cabin. They had learned to strike in waves, one to distract, one to probe for weaknesses, another to attack. Outside, the howls of the pack echoed in the silence, a grim reminder that they would not stop. Their patience was something Samuel could no longer match. The cold seeped deeper into his bones, making each movement slower, more deliberate. His eyes flickered to the window. They were getting closer. The walls groaned under their pressure. The cabin was holding, but just barely. Samuel's thoughts raced. If they got inside, there would be no escape. He needed to think, to outsmart them. But exhaustion was clouding his judgment. His mind was as worn as his body. He had nothing left to give except for his will. Suddenly, a deafening crack split the silence as the door buckled under the weight of the wolves' assault. One final push, and the cabin would be theirs. His heart raced. He had no more time. The wolves were almost in. The final assault came with a force so violent that the door was driven inwards, splintering into pieces. The cabin shook as the wolves surged forward, their eyes glowing in the darkness. But Samuel was ready. He was no longer thinking. He was reacting, Driven by pure survival instinct, he pushed himself from the wall, aiming at the first wolf that came through the broken door. The rifle fired with a deafening crack, the shot true. The wolf yelped and fell to the ground, but Samuel knew that would only momentarily slow the pack. He was running out of bullets. He needed to think quickly. In a last-ditch effort, Samuel grabbed a large log from the corner of the room and hurled it toward the doorway, blocking the entrance with a makeshift barricade. For a moment the wolves paused, confused by the sudden obstacle. It was enough time for Samuel to move, retreating further into the cabin where the remaining meat was stored. His mind raced. He couldn't fight them forever. But the wolves had one weakness. They were hungry, and the scent of the meat had drawn them here in the first place. Samuel acted quickly, pulling down what was left of the meat and dragging it to the farthest corner of the cabin. The wolves, driven by instinct and hunger, followed the scent, their focus shifting to the meat. The room was filled with the growls and snapping jaws of the pack, but as they moved to devour what remained, Samuel knew he had a window of escape. In the chaos, he shoved open the back window, the cold air rushing in, and dove into the snow. The pack was too preoccupied with the meat to notice his departure. Samuel rolled through the snow, pushing himself up, his body aching but still moving forward. The wilderness was harsh, but he had fought through it before. And now, with nothing left to hold him back, he disappeared into the forest. The wolves might have taken his meat, but they hadn't taken his life. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, Samuel Bridger stood tall, knowing that he had survived another night in the unforgiving mountains. The wilderness was still as wild as ever, but Samuel had learned something deeper in the fight. Survival wasn't just about the strength to face the storm, but the strength to outlast it.